and this is lesson 4, Introduction to JavaScript. Now, before we jump in and start talking about JavaScript, there's always a couple of things that I realize in between sessions that I may have forgotten to go over, like from previous subjects. There's just two tiny things that I forgot to mention, so I just want to make sure that we mention them real quick and go over them real quick. But first and foremost, what's on screen right now, we talked about it quite a bit, so I'm not going to go over this again, but this is the basic HTML structure. Make sure that you fully understand this, because as we get into JavaScript and once we start manipulating HTML elements with JavaScript, if you don't understand this HTML structure, things are going to be extra confusing and you're going to be a bit lost in the sauce. So make sure that you're trying to understand this as best as you can. If you have questions about this, ask it offline right now. Like, let's leave today's questions for today's topic, which is going to be JavaScript, unless you have questions about the two very basic things that I'll show real quick. So very quickly, we want to talk about classes. We talked about classes, and this is the sample little document, and this is how it looks like on the, I thought I had it open. Yeah, there it is. I had it open over here. So we had like a little, this is what we did on the last session, just kind of put some random stuff together to show you guys what these elements are, what they do, how you can style them. So with classes, you can have multiple classes. So for instance, if you wanted the div class to be lime and peach at the same time, you can do it, and you would style the individual classes the same way. The only difference is whatever goes underneath in your style sheet is going to override the other class. Just keep that in mind. It's kind of flows kind of like a book. Whatever is the most recent thing that it reads is what it'll use. So for example, if we open our CSS file that's we created for this page, which would be css.css, here I have font size 120, right? So if right below it I say font size 10, it's going to use font size 10 because that's what it's reading last. So same thing with classes. You know, if you're applying fruits lime here and then you're applying fruits peach here and changing the settings, if you have an element that has both classes, it'll take, like, so say that padding is the only thing that's different, you know, it's going to use the class for lime first, which is all of this, and then it's going to use the peach because peach is also a class, and because peach is assigned later, it will use padding 20. So it'll basically be just like this, but the padding will be 20 instead because you're overwriting it here. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm not gonna spend too much time on that because that was last weekend's lesson, I guess. But that's covers the CSS that I wanted to go over. There was one more thing I think that I missed. Let me just check my notes. Maybe not. Maybe that was it. Let me double check. Oh, right. There's one more thing. A value matrix. Okay, so let's look at, we're going to use these fruits here as an example. So when you're giving something a margin or a padding, this is also called shorthand in programming. There's going to be shorthand for JavaScript too, and we'll go over that when we get there. But for CSS, you can shorthand values for things like background, things like border. I know that you guys kind of encountered some of that already. But we're going to go over an example here. So say, for instance, you have margin 10 pixels, right? So what you've done is you've created a margin. Like you know what? I'm going to actually show it to you here because it'll be a little easier so I can actually show you the visuals, right? So let's take this paragraph here, for example. And we're going to just give it like a direct element style. So if we say padding 10 pixels, you notice that there's 10 pixels of padding all around, top, left, well, top, right, bottom, and left, right? There's 10 pixels. Like if I just hover it over here, you can kind of see it. It's the purple. That's the padding, right? So there's 10 pixels on each side. Now you can then override this with a padding top, right? So each individual side has its own value. You can do a padding top and you can say 20. Now if you look at it, only the top one has 20, the rest has the original 10. And then you can go and you can say padding right, and you can go all around, right, bottom, and left, and give them all their individual values. Now again, so if you look at it here, now the right has 30. You can see that the right's a little bigger than the top, which is bigger than the rest, and so on, right? So that makes sense. Now if you wanted each individual side to have a different value, you don't have to do padding right or padding bottom. It depends really on what you're trying to do, but you can actually get away with just using this shorthand here, which the way it works with CSS, and this could be confusing, this is what I consider advanced CSS. So if you assign it two values, so say you 10px, 20px, this is basically doing top, bottom, left, right. So when you have two values, the first value is going to apply to top and bottom. You might want to take notes on this. And then the second value is going to apply to left and right. So if I hover over here, you can see top and bottom is 10, left and right is 20. That's why the purple is bigger on the sides. If you add a third setting, so let's make the third one 30, now it's using its value matrix. Now it's going and say top is 10, right and left is 20, and bottom is 30 when you have three settings. So it basically just broke apart this. Instead of top and bottom, it put the bottom over here now. That's the last one. So if you look at it, you notice top is 10, bottom is 30, left and right is 20. And if you assign a fourth value, now we actually specified every single one of them. I think you guys already guessed if you're thinking about it. Now you set the left value. So now top, right, bottom, left flows just like this from left to right. It's always that same order no matter what, for paddings, margins, etc. So top, right, bottom, left. And if you look over there, there you go. So top is 10, right is 20, bottom is 30, left is 50. So that's shorthand CSS. There's a similar setup for borders. You know, you can do like border 1 pixel solid and give it a color, right? And now I made it white so you can't see it. Let's make it red. You know, so there's your 1 pixel border around this whole entire thing, you know. But so that's the shorthand. Now this is a little different because it's not about the position, and you do have to put it in the right order. For these, I just recommend you look it up. Like, you know, I look it up still to this day for things like background, because in background you can give the image, the position, etc., all in one line if you want to, or you can break it apart and do, for instance, border. If you just do border, it'll be whatever the size, or you could do like border type, you can do border color, etc., etc. So that's a thing in CSS. CSS shorthands or CSS breakdowns, but looking at W3 schools and looking at the list of examples that you have there, you should be able to kind of work that out. It's not too complicated. I hope I was able to explain this properly. And if you guys have any questions about this now would be the time before we go ahead and finally move on to JavaScript.
Can I just go over and make sure that I copied it right? So the first value, when you have two, the first value is applied to top and bottom. The second value is left and right.
Correct.
If you have 3, the first value is top and right. The second is left. The third will be the bottom.
No. So if you have 3, the first is top. The second stays as left and right.
Oh, okay.
And then the third is bottom.
Like a sandwich.
Yes, sure. I mean, I don't know about that, but sure. If that helps you think about it. Analogies are great. Like if you could think of anything that, you know, is similar to related to, that's a great way of remembering it.
But this floor is clockwise.
Well, the fourth one is easy. Yeah, I was just gonna say because it's clockwise.
Okay, great.
And then the first one, 2 values is easy too, because that's just top and bottom are on the same screen.
Right. Or if it's just one, as you guys, is the normal one, it's everything all around, same exact value.
Yeah.
Yep.
The third, I guess third is, that would be good, like a sandwich. Top one is your bread, bottom one is your bread.
Yeah, I guess so. That's a good way to think about it. Now I get the sandwich analogy. It took me a bit to understand that one. Now I get it. It's just looking at top and bottom. I was like, how does a left and a right apply to a sandwich? But okay. I understand. You guys just taught me a new way of looking at it, so I'll explain it like that if I ever have to explain it again. But okay. Any other questions?
That's it for me.
Okay. So let's go ahead and move on now. Let me just triple check my notes here, make sure there's nothing else I'm leaving out before we move away from the CSS world, because we probably won't really, I mean, we'll talk about CSS because there's CSS frameworks we're going to go over, but we're not going to go over like fundamental CSS anymore at this point. I don't see a reason to. So, okay. So moving on to JavaScript now. The first thing we're going to do is just kind of have a basic introductory conversation about it real quick. So how does JavaScript apply to HTML in the first place? Well, JavaScript, sure, it is something that you can use for programming. You can use it for websites, but it is definitely not just for websites. You know, you can use JavaScript to pretty much do just about anything you can think of, really, programming wise, of course. And like, so one of the things that I'll say, like, so off the top of my head, like, I think a couple of uses you can use for JavaScript. You can use JavaScript to run a server. You can use JavaScript if you're, like, for anyone who's familiar with Unity 3D engine, right? They have a language called UnityScript, which is basically JavaScript. It's just a JavaScript API for C#. I know that this is alien talk to some of you guys, so I do apologize. But that is, you know, the idea is JavaScript, this is when we actually start programming. None of the stuff we went over so far has been actually programming. Everything has just been markup and styling. And if you've kind of noticed the pattern, everything we've gone over so far, it's basically, you can summarize it all to just a list of titles and properties and values, and that's it. And that is not programming, that is markup. So now we enter the world of programming. Now, JavaScript, and we talked about this on, I think before we started, I don't know if we talked about it online or not, but we were talking about where the industry is headed and how JavaScript has become the more popular language today. I don't know how it's going to be 10 years from now, but everything is moving in that direction. From my experience in the industry, I don't see anything changing it anytime soon. And the reason being is JavaScript is easy to pick up. It's a language that you can, like I just mentioned, use for various things. But the most important part of JavaScript that makes it such a powerful language is the fact that the JavaScript developers, the people who develop JavaScript, and I don't know their names or anything like that, but they do a very good job at keeping the language modern and keeping the language up to date. Like, there are languages that haven't changed in a really long time. There's still updates to PHP every now and then. There's still updates to Python every now and then. There's still updates to, you know, several languages, but nothing is significant enough that it's adding so much functionality to the language that you can literally, like, reinvent the industry after every couple of years. So when we get into libraries, one of the libraries that we're going to talk about is Jquery. 5 years ago, I would have been teaching you guys how to, if we were doing this 5 years ago, I would have been teaching you guys how to write things with Jquery. Because Jquery is basically a JavaScript library, and I'll explain what a library is in a little bit if you guys don't know what that is. But Jquery is a JavaScript library used to, like, write JavaScript a little faster and a little better. And it was amazing for a really long time. And to this day, there are many websites, just about any popular website that you go to, if you look at the source, a vast majority of them are still using Jquery. We will not be learning Jquery anymore. And the reason why is because with newer versions of JavaScript, everything that Jquery was able to do for you, you can do with what we call vanilla JavaScript, which the term vanilla just meaning plain JavaScript, without any libraries, without anything additional. Think about it as plugins, right? So I think a good way to think of libraries is kind of think of like plugins that you would like install for like a tool. That's a good way of thinking of libraries for now, since if you don't know what a coding library is. So Jquery was a very popular library, and what the JavaScript developers did is they took a lot of the things that Jquery did for JavaScript and implemented into the language itself. And because of that, the language became a whole lot better, because everything that they did, everything that you were able to do with Jquery that would save you a ton of time and would process faster than if you had to write everything from scratch, now is faster and better and safer to do with vanilla JavaScript. Therefore, there is no reason to use Jquery anymore. I mean, there's still going to be very tiny little things that maybe Jquery would do shorter, but there's nothing that you can't do. And after all, in the end of the day, all a library is like pre-compiled code. It's just the pre-written functions for the library that you're for JavaScript. So you have to use JavaScript to make Jquery in the first place. But now you like all the things that Jquery used to make faster is just not faster anymore, right? I don't want to stay on that topic for too long, but moving on. I'm sure you guys have heard of Flash. Flash developed by Macromedia a long time ago. Eventually Adobe bought it. Like back in the day, I know that I'm older than a lot of you guys here, but instead of YouTube, before YouTube was a thing, Flash videos was a popular thing. There were websites that you just get to see these little Flash animations, and Flash was huge. As a matter of fact, the Dynamic D card game that we built was built on Flash. And Flash programming is a language called ActionScript. Now, Flash is dead as hell. It's literally dead. It's 100% dead. There's no support for Flash anymore officially today. But one of the reasons why Flash died a very public and tragic death is because ActionScript is essentially JavaScript, but ActionScript was able to do a whole lot more than JavaScript could do originally. Today, not so much. Today, there's nothing that Flash could do that JavaScript can't do, unless it relates to like Flash specifically and like something that could only be done on Flash. Like when you're talking about, I don't expect anybody here to have Flash experience, but like within Flash, building the movie clips or all the Flash objects or whatever. Other than that, everything that you could do with ActionScript is now basically JavaScript. And if you look at ActionScript code and you know how to read JavaScript, you understand 100% of it. I wouldn't know this. I wrote a whole game in ActionScript. It's just JavaScript. That's all it is now, because JavaScript has become that good that there is no reason to use Flash anymore for anything, and it's just not safe anymore either, because there's a lot of exploits you can available through Flash applications. Therefore, Adobe decided to just kill it. It's just easier that way, and it's done. So today, like every browser that's always striving to be the best browser, Internet Explorer is no longer a thing. Now it's Microsoft Edge. We have Chrome, we have Mozilla, we have Opera. You guys are familiar with all these browsers. One thing that makes a browser great is making sure that they support the most recent versions of JavaScript, so that everybody's shit runs a lot faster, because JavaScript is very optimized these days. But anyway, let's move on to actually JavaScript. Let me actually stop talking shit about it now, and let's just go ahead and start working on JavaScript. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this page today. We're actually going to spend more time on our console. But before, just so that everything we do today, if you guys want to play around with it in your own applications or your own sites that you're working on, we're going to talk about how JavaScript applies to HTML. So first off, script tag, which is an HTML element, is what you would use to start writing JavaScript. Type of the attribute called type would be text/JavaScript, and then everything inside of this tag is JavaScript. And I'm just going to give you a very basic example, right? So if I do a console.log, So this is just a way to output things, and we'll explain it in more. It'll make more sense in a little bit, but here I'm just gonna say output something, and I'm going to save this page now, and I'm gonna come here and refresh. Now that code did nothing visually here, right? We're not seeing anything different. But if I look at our console, and you look at our development in console, see here it says output something. This is coming from what I just wrote inside of the script tag. So this is how you know that this code that you write in here, the JavaScript code, is running, because you see it's here. If I do an alert instead, now alert is a pre-built, pre-existing JavaScript function that browsers have. If you use an alert and you do it and you refresh the page, you have this little pop-up here that says output something. So I just trigger that with JavaScript with these three lines of code, just putting it in the script tag. I can alert something, and it'll alert on the page every time you refresh, and then you click out of it, bam. And as you know, alerts look different in different browsers. Some browsers let you style this alert box, some don't. You know, that's not important for what we're doing today. But everything that you put, the main thing to understand is every single line of code that you write within these script tags is going to be JavaScript code, and you can execute it like that. Now, we're going to actually spend a lot of our day today on this browser console box, because so everything that you write in the console box is actual JavaScript code as well. So let me just kind of explain something. If you have a script tag here and it says alert something, right? When your page renders, it'll go through your script and it'll run your code line by line. That's how the browser is going to go ahead and read your code line by line. Just like it parses HTML line by line and CSS and all that, it'll run your JavaScript code line by line. So it gets that alert. Notice that this page isn't rendered yet, right? You don't see anything behind this pop-up. You only see it after I hit OK. That's because I put this stuff up here. Now if I take this whole entire script tag and move it down to the bottom of the body here, and then I refresh that page, notice that the page is there now. That's because this is only happening now after everything is already rendered. That's important to understand, because it's going to apply later on down the road. But for now, so I'm just going to leave it down here, but I'm going to change it to a console log because I don't want to have to see an alert every single time that I refresh this page. And I'm just going to leave it here. I'm just going to leave it there. It doesn't bother us, right? There it is. Output something. Now, the same thing here. When you're using this console, I'm going to just clear everything on it for now. When you're using this console tab, everything you write here is the same thing. So if I write alert hello, we're going to see our alert hello in here. And everything that you write and press enter, so if I type potato and I press enter, oh, there's an error because potato doesn't exist, and I will get into this in a little bit. But everything that you write here and press enter is basically going to be equivalent to had you pasted it here and refresh the page. So when you're testing JavaScript code in HTML, always, really, almost always, test your logic in your console first. Make sure your code is all working first before you go ahead and paste it in here, because it'd be a hassle to like write code here, change, refresh, try to see, and then go back, change, refresh. Just run the code here, because you could just run it back to back, you know, and then if you like need to retype it again, if you press up on your keyboard, it'll bring back what you just typed, and if you keep pressing up, it goes through your history that you've typed in this console, just like that. It's just up and down arrow keys, so you can kind of play around with JavaScript and do everything in JavaScript on this console before you actually go and paste it into your website to do what you're trying to do in your website. And now I'm not going to just start typing random JavaScript stuff. We're going to break it down, and to break JavaScript down is a little difficult because JavaScript can be very complicated. I spent a lot of time thinking about what's going to be the best way for me to explain this to you guys, at least just the beginning. And I think that the most important concept of any programming language, and here's the good news, once you understand JavaScript, if you ever want to pick up any other programming language, it is going to be really easy, because everything you learn here, you can apply it conceptually to any other language. It's all built the same way for the most part. Everything is relatable. Like, you could always Google, how do I do this JavaScript thing in this language, and you'll find an example somewhere, regardless of what language it is, guaranteed. Because there's always people transitioning from one language to another, so those questions are out there and the answers are out there. But the most basic thing that you can understand, and the most fundamental thing there is to understand about a JavaScript, is a variable. So how do I explain how a variable in JavaScript works? So I decided to create a little analogy. So first of all, before we go into that, I'm sorry, you're gonna see some of these brackets now. You're gonna see the square brackets, you're gonna see the curly and squiggly brackets a lot. You're not gonna see angle brackets as angle brackets. You're gonna see these, you're still gonna see the arrows, or the open close tag, if you will, but it's not going to be used the way we use it in HTML in JavaScript. So don't try to open code and close code in JavaScript with these brackets, because angle brackets are just not used for that anymore. They're either going to come up as less than or equal to sign when you're comparing something, or they'll be for like function indicators. We'll go over them, but this is the beginning of something new. And parentheses, you can add parentheses to this list. You're gonna be seeing a lot of parentheses as well. So on to how we describe a JavaScript variable. So I want you to think about, and I hope that this example is not going to make things more confusing. I think it won't. We'll give it a shot. So I want you to think about it as a box, right? A variable. Think about it like an empty box. It's the best way I could think of trying to explain this. Think about a variable as an empty box in JavaScript. Now, how do you declare an empty box? Well, in JavaScript, you would do, I had something here, it disappeared, but in JavaScript, so we're going to declare a variable, and we're going to call it box. There are 3 ways to declare a variable. We're going to stick to classic JavaScript for now. We're going to get into modern JavaScript with time, because it's important to understand the difference. So we're going to use var, and we're going to say var box, and that's all I've done, var box semicolon. Do you have to put a semicolon in the end of your JavaScript code every line? No, you do not. There are languages that you do. From a stylistic perspective, it's one of those things that we talked about. This is like one of those things that kind of boils down to personal preference in the end of the day. But the way I code, and since you guys are learning with me, I strongly recommend using a semicolon in the end of every JavaScript statement. Why? Because it's easy to understand that this is the end of that JavaScript statement. Just like the end of every CSS, although in CSS you need the semicolon there. In JavaScript you technically don't anymore, but put a semicolon in the end of your statements. It makes it easier to read. And as we get into more code, you'll understand why. So var box. So right now, what I've done is, now another thing to explain about, and this is more particular to how the development console works. Anytime you write anything at all, if you press enter, the next line that you see is what the output is, right? So it's giving you what the value is. Now, I said var box and I said undefined. That's because, so what I've done is created the var box, but it doesn't have a value yet. But now our console, or our JavaScript, acknowledges that box exists because I did var box. There's no value to it yet. And by the way, everything, once I created this on the console, let me explain how this works because it's also important. Once you write a piece of code in here, so like I did var box, that box exists as long as this page is here. If I refresh the page, everything starts over. Everything you've done on the console. So if I refresh this page now, I'm going to refresh it, right? Now we see our output something because I just refreshed everything. This is a new document. So if I type box now, I'm going to get an error because it's going to say box is not defined. And this is a little confusing, right? Because if I say var box, it is defined, but it says undefined. Very confusing. I wish they would have, I wish that they would have used better terminology to describe this kind of stuff. 1 second, let me log out of work real quick. Okay. I wish they would have described this a little better on their errors, right? Because there's a difference. So yes, this is correct. This is not defined, but it exists. not defined, like when you get this red error saying box is not defined, it just basically means it doesn't exist at all. Where this undefined is not an error, it just means that there's like this box doesn't really have a value yet, right? So if I type anything else, like since we went through the fruits example last time, like if I type lime here, right, lime is not defined. But if I say var lime, now if I type lime, it exists. And again, important, I'm repeating one more time, repetition helps remembering, I think. If we refresh, all of it is gone. So now if I type box again, it's gonna give me the error. So if now I'm gonna do var box, now box exists. So all we've done so far is created an empty box. Now the next step is, how do you assign something to that box? So we can say box equals 5. Right, so what is this gonna do? It's not gonna put the value 5 inside of the box. Essentially you are going to put it inside of the box, but you can change it later. You can remove something from the box and change it later. But so let's think about it as box equals 5. You're putting the number 5 inside of that box, right? So now when you say box equals 5, whoops, I said 4, I'm retarded, 5, and if you type box now notice that it has that value of 5. If you change it to something else like 4, which I did by mistake, and you type box like that, it's going to say 4 now, because this is the new value. This is going to take a little bit of practice, and I just remember that we have some people who struggle to see. Hold on a second, I know there's a way to zoom this in. There we go. Let me make this a little bigger. Hopefully that's better to read. Let me know if everybody can see that correctly.
Thank
you. All right, so now you're welcome, and now the box is a value of 4. If you're declaring the when you're declaring the variable for the first time, we're going to refresh again. When you're declaring the variable for the first time, right, box doesn't have any value right now. If you're declaring for the first time, you can already give it a value off the bat. You don't have to just say var box without any value and then give it a value afterwards. You can just say var box equals 5, and it's the same thing. Now box is 5, right? Hopefully that makes sense so far. And now what happens once you assign that value? Now you have that value with the box and it's 5, and now you can use it for anything instead of the number 5. So say you're trying to do a math operation, right? If I do 3 plus 5, the answer is 8. Now because my box has the value of 5 right now, if I do 3 plus box, the value is going to be 8. Does that make sense? Kind of like algebra, basic algebra here, right? X, and let's use an algebra example, right? If I have the equation x equals x plus 3 equals 10, right? Just random numbers. The value of x is supposed to be 7, but because I'm sorry,
7. It's 7.
Okay, well, but because I didn't actually in JavaScript, I didn't actually give x a value, right? If I do x plus 10, it's just going to say x is not defined. Now, if I say x equals 7, and then I do x plus 3, I said 10, the x plus 3, now we have the correct value. And that's how it works. Because now x equals 7, now I can plug it in anywhere, and it has the value of 7. Now, this doesn't only apply to numbers. This applies to what we call strings. And we're going to get a little bit into different types in a second. But so say I have the word, let me think of a word, waterfall, salmon, sure, salmon, and we say box equals salmon, okay? Now, this is a string, this is not a number. So if I say 5 plus box, the value is going to just kind of put them together and concatenate. That's the word that we use in programming for when you're joining strings together. It's going to concatenate it into 5 salmon instead of trying to add 5, the numerical value of 5 to something that's not numerical. So if you're using a plus operation for words, like you say I plus am plus learning, you get the phrase I am learning. If you do 2 plus 5 plus 10, you get the mathematical operation. If you mix in a string in there, like a test word, it adds it to, whoops, I messed it up. But if you mix, so if you add like a letter or a number in here, right? And it kind of uses what you know in math as order of operations. If you have the, well, from left to right, so ignore that. It's technically not really order of operations, right? But it does if you add a parenthesis. It's confusing as fuck. Hold on, let me rephrase that. Ignore the order of operations reference. Ignore that. If you have 5 plus 7 here and then you add a string afterwards, it's going to do the 5 plus 7 first and then add the string to it later. But if you have like 5 plus and then you put a string and then you put the 7 in the end, it's going to change. Now the reason why this happens is the moment you add a number to a string, the value is a string. So everything you do after that, you're doing it to a string. So if I'm doing this plus whatever, it already is just taking this value and adding it to the string. But if I add a parentheses around this, for example, and I do plus 3, it'll actually do this value first and then get the result. Confusing as hell, I know, but does that make sense to everybody so far?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take this side. Okay, good. All right. So let's talk about types of variables or types of values that JavaScript can have. This can get a little complicated. It's now, there's only so many. There's actually, so when you're looking at a variable in JavaScript, or when you're looking at pretty much anything in JavaScript, right? There's different types, you know, and the way you find out the type is you can actually type of variable. So if I do type of box, it says it's a string. So a string means, it's important to understand, so a string means it's basically text. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have letters in it. If I do, for example, box equals open and close quotations, this is a string. It's an empty string. There's nothing in it, but it's still a string. Does that make sense? Strings, quotations rather, is what determines, is how you encapsulate a string in JavaScript. And in JavaScript, you can use double quotes, but just like in HTML, I said you can use single quotes, but don't. I'm going to reverse that for JavaScript. In JavaScript, you can use double quotes, but don't. Stick to the single quotes. And we're going to either use single quotes or we're going to use these ticks, but we're talking about, we're going to cover the ticks later down the road, not today, because that's a little more advanced. That's for concatenation, and we'll talk about that down the road when we get into modern JavaScript. But, so this is a string. So type of open close quote, single quote, is a string. Type of any numerical value at all, like the number 6, it's a number or an integer, but a number in JavaScript. Type of 6.4 is also a number, right? So anything numerical that you can do math with in JavaScript is going to be a number. Anything that's just encapsulated between strings, or between, it's good to think about them strings so then you don't get it confused, but between single quotes it's a string. Now there's more to it. In JavaScript you can also have an array. Now an array is kind of like a value, so we want to look at this box example that we explained here, right? So an array in JavaScript, think about an array as a list of boxes. If you're using variable to think of how a box works, think of an array as in a list of boxes. So like literally if I open up a notepad here and I make like a list of things, right? So I'm gonna say, now they're not gonna have a title like like we did box equals a, right? So an array is gonna be different. An array, say we want to save a couple of things. Say we want to save colors, and we want the colors to be red, orange, and black. Those are 3 colors. So we made a list of red, orange, and black. Now, as list goes, you need a comma in between each value. You don't need a comma after the last value, right? So we have red, orange, and black. So how do you write an array in JavaScript? I'm not going to show you the classic version of writing an array in JavaScript because nobody uses it anymore. You're going to do, so if we're going to make box become an array now instead of a string or a number, you would actually use this open square bracket. So if you're taking notes, square brackets equals array. This is an array in JavaScript. That's an important thing to remember. This is going to come up in everyday JavaScript, so it's very important to remember. And how you will list that is you can have your list here: red, black, I think those are the colors, it doesn't matter, and blue. Now notice that I had to put my single quotes between every single one of these. Okay, if you don't, it's going to expect it to be a variable, and like we didn't define a variable called red, so this doesn't mean anything. This is an error, right? It doesn't work. You can see it right here, reference error, red is not defined. But if we wrap it in single quotes, I have my insert thing pressed, if we wrap this in single quotes, now this is a string, and you can create a box now that's an array of string. Now how does this work? Now if you look at what box is, it tells you that the value is an array, not a string or a number, but an array. And again, an array is just a list of things that you put in there, so a list of boxes, if you will. So if I expand this here, you can see right there red, black, and blue, and it also has this little length property, which is 3. So if you want to see how many items do I have in my box, you can actually go and check the length by doing box.length, and I'll explain the whole dot property thing in a second. Well, not in a second, but in a few minutes. Now how do I access the different sections of my list? Well, these numbers here is what we call indexes. Okay, so think about it like a dictionary index. In JavaScript, arrays are 0 based, which means your first value is not going to be index 1. Your first value is going to be index 0. So if we're trying to get to the first value of the array, here, get ready to start getting a little confused. You're going to do box, open, close the square brackets, 0. Anytime that you're putting in the name of a variable, like in this case it's box, and you're opening and closing the square brackets, it means, what this means is you're targeting a property within that variable, and whether it's an object or an array. We didn't talk about objects yet, we will in a second. So if it's an array, you have to specify the index of what you're trying to look for. If you type red, first of all, red doesn't mean anything, but if you type string red, there's nothing, it's also not going to work. There's nothing there. If you type 0, you can see on the bottom here, without me actually having to press enter, that's red. If I type 1, that's black. If I type 2, that's blue, because this is how we reference those values in an array in JavaScript, right? Now let's talk about objects, and I know that this is going by a little quick, you know, but it's a good thing. I thought about this a lot, and I know that you guys can rewind and rewatch this if you have to, because you might have to for this one. So the next type, and there's more types, we got 3 more to go. The next type is an object in JavaScript. Now when you hear the word object in JavaScript, well, technically an array is an object. So super fucking confusing. Like, the terminology in JavaScript is confusing. I wish it wasn't as confusing. But an object in JavaScript is different. So like now we're going to actually use the same variable, right, box, but instead we're going to make it an object. Now remember I said that an array is always going to be open, close, square brackets. Now if you open and close curly brackets, it's an object instead. Now what is an object compared to an array? Well, it's kind of like the same thing, but instead of you having a list like this, red, orange, and black, you actually have more of like a dictionary. So it's closer to what the variable format is, where you can name your indexes. So you know how by default in an array the index is always going to be 0 is the first one, and then 1 and 2 and so forth. With an object, you actually give a name to each index. So in this example, I'm gonna change up the topic, and I'm gonna keep colors because I don't want to confuse you. We'll use colors for the array. For the object, we will use let me think, foods, right? So wait, let me think about this for a second. I'm trying to think of a good example to use here. We'll go with like actual objects, right? Since it's an object. So for example, we can say truck, or truck, we don't need quotes, is a vehicle, and this is going to be single quotes. We can say that a desk is furniture, and we can say that think of anything else, a camera or phone is a device. Okay, I hope that this kind of association makes sense, right? So now I just declare it an object, right? And I'm still calling it box, but this is an object now. So now this is kind of like an array. If I type box now, this is what it equals, right? Because I changed the value. This is all gone. Everything that I said box equals before is all gone because I overrid the value here of an array, and then I overrid the value here just now with an object. So box is now just this. Everything we did before literally doesn't exist anymore. Even though you see it on the screen, the moment I press enter over here, I reassigned the value to box, and it no longer has this red, black, blue value. Now it has this new value here, which is an object with these 3 indexes. So instead of 0, it's desk because I named it, and it's furniture, and then phone is a device, and then truck is a vehicle. So now I can say, now box.0, or I'm sorry, box 0 doesn't work anymore because that's not an array anymore. If I want to access the desk property, I can either say box desk, like that, furniture, right? Or I can say, and this is how you would normally type this in JavaScript, box.desk. So anytime that you're referencing like a dot in JavaScript is basically how you iterate inside of your objects, right? And this is going to make a little bit more sense again in a little bit. So now we have box.desk is furniture. So can anybody tell me what comes up here if I type box.truck? Vehicle. Okay, good. So you guys are following. Just want to make sure you guys are not completely lost with this example. Box.truck is going to be vehicle. And in some languages they call this a key value pair, and I think that this is a good way of thinking about it. And the reason why they call it a key value pair is because inside of this object you have the key, which is the variable name, right? And then the value, which is furniture. So think about in HTML when you're doing an element, right? Like for example a div, and you have your attribute. So like you can have your div I don't know, ID, you know, you give it whatever ID and you give it class equals whatever. So you hear me say property a lot in HTML. So a way to think about like a JavaScript object is, in a JavaScript object, I could have a JavaScript object that I want to call div, and I can give it like the ID of whatever the ID is, and then I can give it the class of whatever I want the class to be. So class whatever. Now let's talk about syntax, because I just realized here I just kind of brushed over this without explaining syntax at all. So let's take a step back, and well, actually let's stay in objects because we're talking about objects right now. So the syntax of writing an object is always going to be open and close the curly brackets, right? Inside of the curly brackets is going to be the key or the name, right? But I think use the term key because that's what it is. So key is whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter what it is. I'm calling it ID. And then similar to similar to CSS, if you think how we assign CSS styles, right? We look over here in the CSS. It's always going to be like colon value colon value colon value. It's kind of how it works in an object. Now the only difference is if you're going to give it a value, it better be a string, like you know, like I'm gonna just call this scopes, whatever, and then my class is going to be Nora, since John hasn't said a word since we started, right? So ID scopes, class Nora, those are the two properties. These are two strings that I'm assigning as values. Now, how do we add John to this div? He doesn't exist. We don't have John in this div at all. Now let's just say I have a variable. I'm going to actually reassign box, and I'm going to say that box is John. So now we have a variable called box with the value of John. So now if I say, now I can access, okay, let's go back and access what we have. We have div ID is scopes and div.class is Nora. Now what if we go and add like a height property to this div, and I can say div.height. Now right now it doesn't exist, right? It doesn't have a value. It's not there. We can look and open it up and see it doesn't exist. But if I do div.height equals John, that would work, right? But what if I give it the variable box, right? Now intuitively you might think that this might get the value of box, but it will literally get the value of box, which is, as we just assigned here, John. So if I do this, now if we look at div, there is John. Now you kind of, now there's a little bit of what may feel like magic if you're looking at it and kind of trying to wrap your head around it for the first time. Everything is referenced to each other. The way that JavaScript works, it's a reference-based language. And that's another important thing to understand. And that's where it gets more and more confusing at first, right? So although I used the term box here, I actually gave, because it only had the value of string, now we have height John on that div. Now if I come here and I rewrite box again, right, and let's just list the colors we had before, so red, black, and I don't remember the other color, let's go with blue, doesn't matter, right? Now my div is still John. That box no longer is John. I reassigned it, now it's an array, and div is an object. Now why does this get super confusing? Because, well, I can assign another variable now, a brand new variable, and I'm gonna call this variable like new variable, just to make it simple to understand, right? So this is a new variable, and I'm gonna say equals div, right? So now the value for this new variable that I just created is the same exact object that div is. So you guys are obviously learning this now, but I want you to take a guess. If I go to the new variable and I say ID equals stone instead. Now remember, the old div ID was scopes. I just made it so this new variable equals div, and then I changed the ID on new variable. So if I look at the value of div.id, is it going to be scopes or is it going to be stone? Stone?
Stone.
Are you guessing or do you understand why?
It's going to be stone because you replaced it.
Well, I replaced it in new variable though. I didn't replace it in div.
Yeah, but you're not throwing down a div. You're throwing down a new variable. Yeah?
Well, no. If I'm right now, I'm asking is if I go back and look into the values of div, are we expecting the ID to still be scopes or are we expecting the ID to be stone?
No, it's going to change.
Say that?
No, it should change now.
It should change. It will change, and the reason why is because when we assign new variable equals div, it's not creating a new object. The object already exists. It's just referencing the same exact object that div is referencing. So when we change something in that object, we're changing something on this object too. So regardless of what we do, div and new variable are going to point to the same object. And
so
if
that
I go,
equal sign is literally meaning they are equal to each other, and also
literally correct.
Yeah.
Yes and no, because so that's why it can be confusing, right? Because here we said, and I'll explain. I'll show you an example as to why. Like, so here we said div new variable equals div, right? But what if I go here now and I say div equals just test? Just give it a new variable now, right? Now, what do you think happens to new variable? Do you think that now it equals test as well?
No, it should still be stone.
Well, it's not stone. It's the whole entire object. Stone is just the ID property.
You're just overwriting the old information that you had before while the object still remains the same.
You overwrite the reference, right? So, like right now, I pointed this to now the reference to this is a string, and the reference to new variable is still an object. So this is just like, so what Scope said about like, well, it's basically literally equals the same. So not necessarily, you know, it's just the way that the reference in JavaScript works is this object exists if there's something referencing. Now here's the interesting thing about JavaScript is this term that you probably won't hear much called garbage collector. Right, so think about your literally physical garbage collector, like, you know, the truck that comes down the street once a week or twice a week to pick up the garbage. If there's nothing using it, it will disappear. The garbage collector will go by, and if there's something that's there that's not being used, it'll disappear. So, like for example, again, now if I say div equals new variable, there's nothing pointing to this string test, therefore it's gone now. And now both div and new variable equals this object, you know. But so this object exists because there's something that has like that's referencing it. Now, if we go ahead and erase this with null, now null is a way to explicitly undefine something. Or so null basically means no value. You could also do undefined. Null is just a little easier to write, obviously. And so now you're nullifying that variable. Now new variable doesn't have a value, and div still has that object. But if I now go and say div equals null, now there's no references to this object anymore. So I can't get back to that object anymore unless I rewrite it. It's gone, right? There's nothing on my list of variables that has this value at all. And I could go into the debugger and show you guys, but I don't want to confuse you with showing you the debugger right now. But there's like, out of all the variables that I wrote, box is still that array, div is null now, new variable is new now. None of this has a reference to that object anymore. Although you can see it here, that object is gone. Now, let's add another layer of confusion. So we have box is an array. Now we're gonna go ahead and reassign. We're gonna remake that object that we had before. Okay, let me just go back to it so I don't have to rewrite it from scratch. So okay, right here. So div id scopes class Nora. Bam. So now my object is back because I just recreated it from scratch. Now I can say div.list equals box. Right? Box is this array. Remember, it's this array of red, black, and blue. So now that I made the list property an array, now we have an object which has three properties, class ID and list, where the value of list is a reference to that array. And now we can go and say div.list.push. Now push is a built-in array variable to add an element to an array that already exists, right? And this is gonna get this is something that I don't expect you guys to all remember right off the bat. We're gonna keep going over a lot of JavaScript functionality like this. But so instead of doing that, right? So the same example that we just showed with changing this property here to stone or whatever. Instead of editing this list property, we're gonna just go ahead and back and edit this div variable, which is I'm sorry, the box variable, which is this array, and we're gonna say box.push. And this adds a variable. So say if I add purple, right? Now the box has an extra color there that I just added. And if I look at div, it has that list. It points to the same list, so it also has purple in it. Okay. Now here's the interesting part. Each individual index of an array does not have to be all strings. They could be anything that another variable can be, which means you can this could be another array inside of an array, or it could be an object inside of an array. It doesn't matter. So now if I say box.push and I say div, right? Now I just pushed this object into this box array. So now the fifth element of this array is this whole entire object. But if you remember, this object has the list. Now this is what we called circular reference. You open the object, you have a list. The list is an array. You open the array. The fourth object is this object. If you open that object, the list property is the list. If you open the list, the fourth property is this object, and this you could go on forever and ever and ever and ever opening this. It doesn't mean that this thing is huge. It's just a circular reference. This is just trying to wrap your heads around how reference works in JavaScript, right? We have an object that it has an array inside of it that has a reference to this object inside of it. Does that make sense? Does this example kind of wrap your head around?
It's an inception.
Yeah, pretty much. It's what was that, John? What did you say?
So you just started a rabbit hole.
Yeah, you can think about it like that. I just started a rabbit hole, but there's nothing wrong with this rabbit hole, because in the end of the day, you can't think about it as like, it's important not to think about this as like, this is an object, and then in the object, there's a list, and in this list, there's that's not how you think about it. You think about it as, this is an object. This object has a reference to a list. This list has a reference to the object. Does that make sense? That's how you think about it. That's how JavaScript works. You know, so
now would that be like bad practice to do, to have it like constantly referencing itself through itself through itself? Like, would that be
no, actually
want to happen, or is that something that's like commonly done?
It's actually commonly done in modern programming for a lot of reasons, and you know, once we start getting into ABuffs, you're going to see a lot of situations where we might cross-reference the same objects or arrays or things like that, because there's just sometimes it's just easier that way. Like, you know, so if I could think of a quick example off the top of my head. So very recently I was working on the users list. I worked the Discord integration for BTC Hue, right? So in BTC Hue, I'm going to Discord, and so this is a good, now that you guys kind of understand how this works, I can actually literally explain this real life example that I just dealt with very recently, right? So I create my Discord object, right? So I'm going to say var Discord, and this Discord object is going to be information that I get from that user from Discord. So I'm going to have the user ID. It's going to be whatever ID it is. I'm going to have the user screen name. I was using myself as an example, so in this case it's Stone. I'm going to have the avatar. This is like a list of it's just like some random code that like basically how my avatar is saved in the Discord database. Okay, so now I have my Discord object. Now in my own website, right, I have a user list. So I can have my user list, and in my user list I just basically have, well, it's an array, and it's an array of objects. Now each individual item here is going to be a list of objects. Now the first object, let's just say that this is Scopes' username, right? Just for the sake of example, and I'm going to indent this to make it a little easier for you guys to read. So let's just say the ID is 1, the name is Scopes, but then I want a reference to his Discord. Now, I don't have a reference for his Discord. I have a reference for mine, though, which is the one I just created above called Discord. So for mine, I'll have ID 2, name Stone, and then I'm not going to confuse you guys. Whoops. I'm not going to confuse you guys by writing shorthands, because there's a shorthand for this, but I'm just going to say Discord is Discord. Now I'm pointing to this Discord variable that I just created here, and I'm assigning I forgot the equal sign here. So var user equals open array, right? And then each item is going to be an object. Now remember, this is the start of an object, this is the end of an object. So this is the first index, and it's only the comma in an array that's going to set. I know this looks confusing, right? But this is basically just 2 items in an array, and that's it. So now I have my 2 users.
Names?
No, they're just objects.
I thought you wanted semicolons to end every item you had instead of.
I did. No, so these are not. So this is a list. Okay, you can't put semicolons after this. That would be incorrect. The semicolon goes here. It's after every statement you want a semicolon. And what you just said right now is exactly why I want a semicolon in the end of every statement. Because that way you know when a statement ends. This statement only ends over here.
Because technically that could be one line, couldn't it? That could all be in
this could all be one line, yes. The only reason why I indented it like this is so that you guys could easily read it. And when we write code, I mean, if I'm just going to pull up like a random BTC Hue file here for you to look at how I typically write my code, right? So let's look at components chart. Okay, so like if you can see here, so this is basically literally the same kind of thing that I just wrote in front of you guys right now. This data sets is an array. Inside of this array you have 2 objects, and I literally wrote it exactly the same. This is all indented, right? And now this is inside of another object, which is inside of another array, another object, and this statement only ends here. That's my semicolon. So it could get pretty confusing, which is like, so this is like a huge example of what I'm just talking about, and this is used in very commonly in everyday programming. This is why, like, it's gonna take a little bit. It's gonna take some practice for you guys to wrap your heads around like a really long, complicated reference of like objects and arrays and things like that, right? So but anyways, just to kind of wrap up this example, so now I have my user here. Okay, now in the current example that I had, I already had access to the Discord object, and I wanted to access this object from where I was. Instead of having to look up the name and start from scratch from the user database to find the name Stone, I could very easily just say Discord dot user object, right, equals, and then I'm just gonna say user 1. Now again, remember, 0 is scopes, 1 is me because I'm the second one in there. So user 1 is me. So now if I look at my Discord object, I have the Discord information and I have my user object. Or if I look at the users array, which is all the users that I just created, there's scopes first, and then there's me second, and then there's my Discord object. And my Discord object also has a reference to this same exact to just my instance in that array, not the whole entire array from scratch, but just my index in that array. And that's like a real life example of something that I literally just did a few 2 days ago. That I just wore. It looks somewhat like this, not 100% like this. I kind of simplified it a bit, but that's kind of like how the structure for the Discord object and my user object is on my code, just like that, right? Because that's a real life example. We're not done, but so far we've gone over 4 different kinds of what a variable can be, right? We've gone over a string, we've gone over a number, we've gone over an array, we've gone over an object. So I think that the last thing to go over now is a function in JavaScript. So before we get into a function, let's talk about why use functions in the first place. Now the function syntax is going to be a little confusing at first. I even considered breaking this apart into a separate class, but because this is recorded and you can always rewind, if anything, you know, screw it. Let's just kind of go over the whole thing. That way we cover all the different types. And then in the next lesson, we're going to talk about more practical applications, and we're going to go over some examples and things like that. Right now, we're just listing the fundamentals and what everything is and what everything means, okay? So let's look at before I explain function, it's better to explain with a couple of things. So let's just say I want to do a mathematical operation, okay? I want to do like variable a equals 2, and then variable b equals 3, and I want to do a plus b plus 21, you know, and that's the list of that's like the sequence of events that I need to happen, right? So remember when we talked about programming on day one, we said that it's essentially a list of instructions, right? So this is the list of instructions. Now, this is just an example. Obviously, this is useless, right? Why would we want to do this? But it could be just about anything. Maybe you're doing something to a string, or maybe you're doing something or whatever, right? There's a reason why we chose to do these 4 things in this order, okay? Now, when you write, now let's just say that in our code or in our website, we need to do this all the time. So instead of having a bunch of little script tags everywhere that goes and runs those 4 lines of code every time you need to do it, we can make a function to do it all in one step instead. So we're going to make a function, and this is like the classical way of writing a function. It's going to change once we get to modern JavaScript, but everything that I'm showing you here still works. You know, it still applies. And I know that at one point I said I'm not going to show you how to do things you don't need to do anymore, but it's easier for me to explain the classic method first, because then I could explain why we're doing something a certain way with the modern version. So it's going to be important for you guys to kind of wrap your head around the classic way of writing things. So this is the syntax for writing a function. First, you start with the word function, and then you name the function. We're going to name this function do math, like that. Okay. Now we're going to open and close parentheses. Every single function needs this open and close parentheses. Why? Because this is where you list the parameters for the function. Now, we're not going to talk about parameters for a function yet, but if you do not have parameters for your function, which we don't, it's blank, but you need it. It needs to be there. Whether you have parameters or not, you need this open and close parentheses. And this is not going to change for modern JavaScript. It's going to remain the same. And then this is when you start writing the body of the function. So similar to how you start writing the body of a CSS property after you write the selector, you do open and close squiggly bracket. Kind of like an object, but this is always going to go right after the open and close parentheses, and it ends here. Okay. Now for functions, you don't need a semicolon in the end. You will need a because it's not a statement. This is the declaration. Okay. A little confusing, I know, but so now we're going to indent in this function, and now we're going to actually go ahead and do everything that we did above. We're going to say var a equals 2, var b equals 3, and then a plus b equals 21. And just for this, so we can confirm that everything happened the way that we coded it, we're going to say console log everything is done. So our function is done, right? That's, so again, statement, 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 all have semicolons in the end. Okay. Now we created a function. The function is called do math. All we've done, I wrote something wrong. What did I do wrong? Invalid assignment, left hand side. Oh, whoops. Did I do that? Oh no, I think I did. It was supposed to be a plus b plus 21. Okay, that's my bad. And then here we did console log everything is done. Okay, so all we've done right now is assign a function. Okay, now the way that JavaScript handles this, and again this is more fundamental understanding of how JavaScript handles this. This function is called do math. Okay, so this is like no different than had we done, just so you guys could understand, var do math equals function. No different. This is the same thing, but this is the classical way of writing the function. Now, the reason why I'm showing you var do math equals function is because it's important to understand that even though we wrote the function like this, function do math, the name of the function is the variable name for that function. So remember the empty boxes, how that will be a reference to something, right? Whether it's a reference to a string or a reference to an array or a reference to an object. Now, because we wrote this, do math is a reference to this function. And that's your fifth and final type of a variable. So let's go over the types again, and I'll get back to a function in a second. String, might want to take notes. So 5 different types. You got your string, you got your number, you have your array, your object, and your functions. That's basically it. I'd say basically, like, if that's simple. It's not simple, but that's it. Those are the 5 major types. God damn, can you stop calling me? Jesus Christ. And we have, I forgot one. There's a 6, Boolean. We're not going to talk about Boolean too much today. But a Boolean is actually super straightforward. A Boolean is either true or false. So, true, false. That's a Boolean. We're going to talk about Boolean down the road. I don't think we're going to cover that today at all. But that's the 6 types. So there's actually 6 types off the top of my head. I may be forgetting a few. These are the 6 major types of variables that you can have. Okay, so one more time, final time. String, also make sure I got them all. String, number, array, object, function, and Boolean. Those are the types. Okay. Now, function do math. All we did here is declare the function. No different than had we done var apple equals green, sour apple, whatever, right? All we did was just declare a variable. We didn't actually do anything. All of these things inside of the function, notice that we at nowhere at any point did we see this console log come up, because this code never executed. The code needs to execute for us to actually see that console log come up. So how do you actually go ahead and actually run the do math function? You would do math, open and close. If we do math without the open and close, we're just referencing it. Okay, we're just referencing that function. We're not doing anything to it. If we do math with the open and close parentheses, now we are executing the function. And now everything that's inside of that function will happen line by line. Just think about it as in every time you wrote the function, it's the same as if you copied and pasted everything inside of that function instead of doing this. Does that make sense? I hope so. It's the same thing. So like by running do math like this, it's the same thing as if I took everything inside of here and ran it like this instead, right?
So it's giving it like a shortcut.
Yeah, it's a shortcut for
like
a
a
list
macro
of yeah. That's a great way of thinking about it.
Is a better way.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it if you're familiar with macros.
So now if you reference A and B, they have a value?
No, they don't.
Okay.
And that's another thing that's a good question. That's a very good question. Very good to explain. So, within the function, when you write a function, right? When you're assigning a variable inside of this function, and then this is when we get into variable scoping. This value will only pertain to the function. The moment the function is over, the garbage collector goes and does away with those variables. They don't remain in the code. Okay, but, and this is to get more confusion, right? So if you declare a variable outside of this function, so let's call x, if you declare this variable outside of the function and make it 10, and then you reference that variable from inside of the function, instead of doing a plus b plus 21, I'll do a plus b plus x. It will know that the value is 10, because this is what we call a global variable, because it was declared like on the main context of the program. So like just to kind of clarify, let's do a full
What
refresh.
would happen if you did variable x inside the function now? Like equal, like, you know, like overwrite it inside the function?
No, you will not overwrite. You will overwrite it inside of the function as long as you're in the function. And I know you're getting a little ahead. I will get to all that stuff. You're getting a little bit ahead, and I'm actually appreciated. It means you have a really good understanding of what we've gone over so far, and that's good. But we will cover the scoping of variables and things like that a little more down the road. Right now, I just want to kind of make sure that everybody is familiar with what the different types are and what everything is individually. Right, so ideally, like a set of instructions, right? Like, so let's forget about the concept of just to kind of simplify things a little bit. Let's forget about the concept of declaring variables inside of the function for now, because I don't want to make this too confusing. Let's think about this, and I already have a do math assigned, so I'm gonna have to change the name. So let's call it do words, right? Let's just put a couple of console log lines here and say this is the start, and then here we're gonna say this is the middle, and then here we're gonna say this is the end. So this is the function, and again, notice that nothing happened. I didn't do anything. Now if I were to copy and paste these 3 lines over here, it'll run all of this code, right? So every time I run it. So back to Nora's example, like a macro. So by saying do words, it's kind of like a macro to run that code. Now it gets more confusing when it comes to variables, and that's when these parameters kind of come in too. Now I don't know if, let me look, what time is it? Let me check. Okay, we're already at 6:20. Yeah, we're going to, I did spell middle wrong. Sorry about that.
So what you're saying is you can add like stated outer function variables into a function where A and B inside the function only matters. You can add X inside the function as long as it's stated beforehand.
Correct. That's a good way of thinking about it. Like, so like, you know, remember how we talked about very early on that everything you put here, when you refresh the page, this will happen. Everything we did here disappears, right? Yeah. So just for the sake of example, we're gonna say variable John equals I don't know, human. Okay. So now when I refresh this document, we have that, and you just kind of go ahead and close that example. So now we have John is human, right? Because that's declared in the script. Just think about it as like when I ran that script, that var John equals human happened in JavaScript, just like everything we type here. The only difference is everything we type here will go away once we refresh. You know, okay, that's the difference.
That variable John is stated to be human. That is always going to be human. The garbage man is never going to come pick that up.
Unless, correct, unless, well, yeah, unless you literally go and say John equals undefined.
Yeah, unless you overwrite that.
The variable will still be there, but the value of human will be gone, right? So now if we do a function, and I'm just going to call this sample function, right? We're going to make a sample function, and we're going to just basically go and say console log John. And this is a little confusing, right? So when I do sample, the console log is human because John had a value inside of this function. Now what if sample2 I say John equals lizard? Okay, so now when I run sample2, John is lizard because it's changing the value here and then it's outputting it. But what is the value of John? Now it's what was that? What was the question?
That should only be in that function then, no?
Well, no, because you're accessing a global variable from within this function and changing the value. So this function, like, if it's a parameter, then you only change the parameter. But we're not going to get into parameters today. We're going to get into parameters on the next session. In the next session, we're going to get very, very deep into how you can manipulate different functions and how you can call a function from a function and why, like, how powerful functions really are, because this is just the beginning. Like, you know, this is literally just doesn't even scratch the surface of what you can do with functions. This is just like a introduction example of what a function actually is, right? And what all these types of variables is. It was a quick overview, and it took us literally a whole entire hour to go over all these different types of variables that you can have in JavaScript. But the main thing that's important to note, just based on what we've gone over so far, and rabbit hole is a great word to describe what you can do, is a variable can reference any object, which can reference any array, which can reference any object, which can reference any function, which can reference any object, and so on and so forth. Essentially, anything can reference anything. So as far as like what you can do with it, it's basically the sky's the limit. You can do whatever the fuck you want, really. Like if you are creative enough to come up with a list of things that you can do with that basic understanding, right? So the last and final thing that we're going to go over today, and then we're going to get into more than basic JavaScript on the next lesson, but this was just kind of like a basic overview of what all these things are and what they mean, is how do you determine, and now that we've gone over this, it'll be easier for me to explain, how do you manipulate an HTML element with JavaScript. So like, say for example, we look over here, and I want to change the value of this button here. Instead of, see how it says this is a button? I want to use JavaScript to change that to say this is. I'm just gonna change it to say whatever, you know. I'm just make it literally gonna change it and make it say whatever. Okay. So the first things first. Now, there's gonna be a couple of objects that are already predefined. This is like already objects that the browser has created when you render this page. Okay. So these will take remembering, you know. But the first object, first and most important object, is document. Document refers to your whole entire HTML document. It is a JavaScript object that represents that document. The variable, or the box if you will, is called document. And inside of this document we have a function called query selector. Query selector is a function, okay? And this is a function that you can use to navigate through your different elements on your web page, and the way that you use it is literally the same exact way that you would reference something in CSS. So this is the only button on the page, so we can just say button like this because it's the only button on the page. Now you guys already know from what you've done with your example so far that if this was something with a class or an ID or whatever, you could do the same thing. Like, do we have any here? I don't remember. Let me just very quickly check. Okay, so we have like this div ID is grape, right? This is a paragraph. So if you're trying to target something by ID, you can target it like that. The ID is grape, so we could type grape, and notice here that's my div right there, div ID grape. That's that element that I'm referencing with a query selector. But right now the focus is to change object. Okay, so when we look at this object now, so this is like the DOM element, which is the JavaScript interpretation of what this button object is. And if you expand that, you can see all the information that this button has, you know. And then where it says this is a button is the inner HTML or inner text, either or, they're interchangeable for this button. So if I say document.querySelector.button, and then I change inner HTML to equals whatever, just like I said I was going to do, I just changed the value of that button to whatever using JavaScript. Now, how can you simplify this? You can make a variable called button, and you can make that variable equals the value of this function, document query selector button, just like that. Right now, when you type button, this is this button. So now I can change. Now I have this variable that I created called button, which is that button right there. Now I can say button dot inner HTML, and I can or text, really, it doesn't matter, and I can make this like literally whatever value I want, and I am using JavaScript to change all of that. And that is like the basic way that you can use JavaScript to reference anything in here and alter its values or its elements, and you can inspect it and see what are all the different things that it has. You can literally even change, like if you have an image, you can change the source of an image and make an image change into another image, and so on and so forth. There's really, you can do whatever you want because all the information is there and it's accessible with JavaScript. Now, I don't want to get into this today, but like if I want to assign a click event into this button with JavaScript, you can do that too. You guys are already familiar with anchor tags. Now anchor tags work by default. It's like href or whatever. Now again, HTML code does not work here. This is JavaScript. Don't type HTML in JavaScript unless of course you do it in a string, because you can insert HTML into a document with JavaScript, but the HTML code needs to be all within a string for you to insert it, and there's like different ways to insert it. So like if I wanted to target, like, so I think it was grapes, right? So document.query selector grapes, grape, and then I wanted to enter HTML, and I wanted to go ahead and add a button in that element. I can do button, and here I'm gonna say this is a button now, and I can add HTML. So look at that, I just added an HTML button to that grape div using JavaScript. Does that make sense? Does that clear up, like, you know, the basics? Like, now you're able to understand that, you know, document is an object and query selector is a function. So the same way that we went over that user example, the same way we went over, like, you know, showing how an object inside of an object can be all. I know this is a lot. I don't expect you guys to be like, oh yeah, I totally get it. You know, this
bypassing HTML using JavaScript.
It's not bypassing. I mean, your JavaScript controls your HTML. You're not bypassing anything. Once this is rendered, you can basically manipulate it with JavaScript to do whatever you want. But JavaScript is not meant to just manipulate HTML. You can use JavaScript to do just about everything that you can think of, really. And we can go into we're going to get into more and more complex examples of JavaScript usage as we go along. And if you feel lost right now, don't worry. It's okay. If it's going to help you, as long as you understand the fundamentals, and I'm just going to very quick list the fundamentals before we wrap up this video.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, like, a use case scenario, just to help, just to explain it a bit better. Like, let's say you wanted to use your JavaScript instead of saying it's manipulating HTML. Let's say you had a picture in a div, and let's say when you click a button, you want that picture to change. You use JavaScript to change that picture.
JavaScript would not be the only way of doing it, but you absolutely can use JavaScript, and you would make it so the action of that button is just JavaScript code that's targeting that picture and then changing the source attribute to the new picture. Yeah, but that is manipulating HTML, though.
Yeah. But you have to have the HTML to begin with.
Right, you know, but you could also create it from scratch and then do it too with JavaScript. True. Which is not the correct way of doing things. I mean, you shouldn't create HTML with JavaScript just because you can. It's kind of stupid. Why do that when you can have an HTML file? You know what I mean? At the very least, if you're like pulling an external HTML file in, at least have an HTML file somewhere that you can like pull the contents of with JavaScript and then put it in your code instead of like literally sitting there and writing HTML in single quotes. It's kind of, that doesn't make sense, you know. If you're doing one element, then it's fine, you know, and that happens a lot. But a whole entire like set of HTML code, you know, that's when we wouldn't do something like that. And we're gonna get into examples of that because that does happen. Sometimes we need to like insert a whole bunch of HTML code with JavaScript, but you don't do that by writing HTML code in JavaScript. There are better ways to handle that, and we'll go over that. It's just it's just a combination of using the right tools and the right techniques to do it, basically. But you can do it like that. Like, you know, that's the thing. Like, just because you shouldn't do it doesn't mean you can't do it. You could write like this whole entire thing from scratch in JavaScript. It's going to be a pain in the ass. It's going to be very difficult to read, rather than just writing it in HTML. You know what I mean? There's no reason to write it in JavaScript just because you can. That's like one of the whole separation of concerns conversation. Now, one final thing here that I forgot. So the same way that we have like this script here, right? I'm gonna move it up here to the head. You can target a separate file as well, and the way you do it is actually just the same way you reference an image. You'll go source, and then here, like, just say you make a JavaScript folder and you call it script.js, script.javascript, and you have to close. It's an empty script tag, right? Like, just like that. And now again, the script doesn't exist, right? Because I didn't create it yet. So if you refresh, it's going to tell you, it should tell me that there's a problem referencing that script. I think it'll tell you, like, if you look at it on your network tab, it's going to try to load that script. Let's go. Load the script, please. It's not trying to load my script. I don't know why, but let's go ahead and... Did I have that wrong? Let me actually make sure.
Is it like
HTML.
a new thing where it won't try to run it if it's not there?
It should give you an error. Yeah, it is just script source. Okay, so let's just go ahead and put a script there. I don't know why it's not giving me an error. Maybe because it's local. I'm not sure. But... So script type text JavaScript, source script.js. So I'm going to go ahead and make a, I'm just going to, because I don't have a project set up in NetBeans, it's a bit of pain in the ass to create new files. So I'm just going to come here to where we have this. Oops, that's not right. Web Development School. I'm going to make a new JS folder. And I'm going to make a new file here. I'm going to call it script.js, just like that. And now I'm going to just open it in NetBeans. And this is all, like, now you don't need tags. This is all just JavaScript. And I think I had it John equals, I'm just going to keep him as a lizard now, not a human anymore. Just to make sure it didn't, just to make sure this works. So refresh. Okay, let's make sure if I look at the value of John, yep, it worked. I don't know why we're not getting errors when it's not. You should get an error. I mean, I see those errors all the time when I'm trying to reference scripts that like are not there. I'm not sure why it didn't come up here, but so there's an easy way to test, make sure your script is working. Just something like this, you know, refresh. Okay, your script is working. You know, that in case you don't get the errors for whatever reason. I'm not sure why I didn't get the errors there. But that wraps up today's lesson. This is a very, very thorough introduction. You know, I covered more ground than I thought I'd cover today. So I'm kind of happy. I thought that I wasn't going to be able to get into the objects and the arrays. Maybe it wasn't a good idea to get into the objects and the arrays yet. We'll see how we do. But we're going to continue going over these things as we did with the other subjects. It's just that JavaScript is where we're going to basically stay now for the rest of the lessons for the most part. We're going to have a couple more JavaScript lessons. I got to edit that lesson plan because it's definitely way too much to cover in one lesson. Now, before I wrap this up, since we're getting close to that 2 hours, and I apologize for that. I tried to keep it short, but let me just go through this list here, make sure that I did not miss anything. General syntax, variables, function statements. We didn't even, yeah, there's a lot more we got to cover JavaScript-wise. We only just talked about types of variables and types of, you know, basically that's it. We just talked about what the different types of objects or variables can be in JavaScript so far, and we talked about functions a little bit, but there's a lot to get through still. So think about this as introduction to JavaScript part 1. I'm going to change it here, and we're going to go into introduction to JavaScript part 2 on the next lesson, and we can talk a little bit about when that lesson is going to be offline. Does anybody have any questions as we close this one off?
Yes, go in your Google Chrome real quick.
Okay. Well, I don't have Google Chrome open. Is this what you were talking about?
No, open up Google Chrome real quick.
Okay. Google Chrome.
Okay, now go to your search bar and put www. .p. Oh, you lucky son of a bitch. Never mind.
Oh, please. I see where you're going with this.
Real professional,
we are
John.
That was literally for brass, bro.
I am live, John. Anyway.
Just had a great lesson, and John's question was that.
Wow. I actually thought you had a real question.
Disrespectful.
I guess John doesn't know how to use private browsing. Anyway, I will close this off over here. And thank you, everybody. I don't use my computer for that anyway. But anyway, let's go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you guys very much for the time. If you got questions, don't refrain from using our questions chat. We have Kadri as somebody who is very resourceful and knows this stuff very well. You know, so if I can't get to your questions right away, she'd be able to answer. You know, but if not, I'll answer them, obviously. And a lot that you can kind of start practicing already. I can imagine just kind of playing around on your console with JavaScript. There's a lot of different things you can play around with, and I hope you do experiment with JavaScript as we go on. Hopefully this is going to be similar to our previous ones, that when we get into the next one, you guys have already figured out a whole bunch of things about it that I didn't explain yet. We'll see. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just, hopefully for me, that'll be less. No. I mean, hopefully you guys do spend a little bit of time at all, like with JavaScript. Otherwise, this is going to be, you know, I do expect you guys to do a little bit in between these lessons, because if you don't, you're not going to retain anything, I don't think. So that's just
I have a real question.
Okay.
I asked it before, but I'm going to ask it again. So you can change an outer function variable inside of a function, and it will override that and change the attribute, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you can.
Okay.
But if you create one inside the function, it cannot be referenced outside the function.
Correct. That's correct. And we'll get into that with a lot more detail. That's called lexical scoping, which is how JavaScript scopes variables. And we'll get into it with a ton of detail because we didn't even cover parameters or anything like that yet. So we'll be able to get into that on the next lesson probably.
Okay, but the basic gist of it is, while A can be 2, inside of the function, if A is 3, it is not 3 anywhere else except for that function.
Correct. If you're declaring the variable inside of the function, then yes, that is correct. Now, if you guys are ever like trying to figure out and watching things again, and this is a problem that I have as a teacher that I have to sometimes go back and remember, is syntax. Syntax is very, very important. I think I try to like show how things need to be written. So syntax in JavaScript. Okay, I did. Okay, good. So your syntax has to be correct. If it's not, you're gonna get a big old syntax error and nothing's gonna work. If you're seeing the error saying syntax error, it means something's wrong with how you wrote it. That's what that means. And it usually will tell you what line number it is. So like, do read the errors. Don't be like one of those people that just refresh. Why is this not working? There's a reason it's not working. Like, read the error. Like, open your console, look at your console. Like just show you a very quick example, right? So here, if I come here and I'm gonna like do a console log test, okay? I'm gonna do a couple of these. Whoops, let me do a new lines. But on this last one, I'm going to like not close this, okay? Not gonna close the parentheses or the semicolon. So my IDE already is telling me right here that there's a syntax error, okay? But I'm gonna ignore it because I didn't notice that, right? And I'm gonna try to refresh this page. So if you look at the browser, like it says right there, syntax error, missing close parentheses after arguments list, script.js line 5. Like, this could not be more detailed, you know. So just go in your code, look at line 5. You know, the line is incorrect because it doesn't know where you're trying to close it, but you'll be able to see you're missing a close parenthesis somewhere around there. You'll be able to go ahead and find it and close it, and now when you refresh, everything's great and we get all our tests that we pasted over here.
I prefer the spam refresh approach.
Now, is that only in that developer tool, or will it do that on any browser by default?
Every browser has a development tool these days.
What do you want right now, Mozilla Firefox?
Yeah, I'm on Firefox Developers Edition. Strongly recommend it. If you're gonna do web development, I recommend you use this and not Chrome. That's my recommendation. It's just better for development.
Microsoft Edge.
Oh my God! Don't talk to me about Microsoft.
No,
browsers.
I'm sorry. I was.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Microsoft Edge, honestly, I'm going to be very honest, I don't use it. I've never used it. I am traumatized by Internet Explorer. I will never touch a Microsoft browser ever again in my life. So if Edge is better than Chrome and Firefox combined, I'll tell you right now, I'll never know because I will not use it. I refuse. Like, like as a developer who's been developing for the past 12 years, more than that actually, now that I think about it, but the very common issue that you were run into as a web developer and you made an application or you made a website for a client was, okay, so this website's done, now let's go ahead and fix it for Internet Explorer. Literally, fix it for Internet Explorer, because Internet Explorer did not render anything correctly. So you have to open Internet Explorer and you have to go there and basically just hack your own code to make it so Internet Explorer reads it the way you want everybody else to read it. And that's the worst part about it is, back in those days, most people buy a computer from Best Buy or whatever, and what's the browser that's installed by default? Internet Explorer. And nobody, you know.
Forever.
Yeah, so, yeah, developers who have been developing for as long as I have hate Internet Explorer, and I will not give Microsoft Edge a chance. I think Chrome is a better browser overall. I think for development, Firefox is better. Firefox Development Edition is better for development, in my opinion. But we'll close.
Some extensions.
Or do you have to pay for it?
It's free. One thing you'll learn about me real quick is that if I have to pay for software, I'm not going to use it. I'm cheap. I am not gonna. I don't pay for software. Your ID is shit. All right, everybody. We're going off a line. This is the end of the session, and hope everybody has a good one in stream.